Malta and Gozo, and welcome to another edition of Lovin Daily. I'm Tim Diacono, joined today by JP at Sapardi, and today we have a very special guest, Dr. Jean Karl Soler, a medical doctor, a Maltese medical doctor, who will be discussing his views about the COVID-19 pandemic. His views are quite unorthodox, so it should be quite an interesting discussion. But
absolutely.
Before we get to that, these are the stories we're going to be discussing today. Marsa Fon's waterfront has been completely pedestrianised. Bernard Grech is promising to get Malta off the grey list within 90 days if he becomes Prime Minister. A restaurant has faced a backlash after offering free meals to vaccinated people. The EU has flagged concerns on the political ownership of One and Net, and a man has ended up at the Nashar police station after trying to pay a fine in coin. So, JP, let's get into this. The Marsa Fon waterfront has been completely pedestrianised. What can you tell us about it?
Absolutely, yeah. It was a €3 million investment known as the Marsa Fon Master Plan, which was meant to prepare the locality and rebuild it in time for summer, so families and children can now play freely without fearing any accidents or any traffic passing through the Marsa Fon area during certain times of the day. The Mena area has become completely pedestrianised, which means limited access for vehicles with exceptional cases of public transport, access to slipways, and specific times for certain services. I think it's a great initiative to see that some of these areas, these beautiful, Gozo areas, are being pedestrianised to allow people to enjoy it without the fear of being run over or cars passing through, or the exhaust from cars in the centre, allowing people to get out there and actually enjoy the everything the locality has to offer. Kind of follows similar to what's being done across the islands in terms of the slow street project, which still has come to fruition. But seeing this happen in Marsa Fon is definitely a step in the right direction for, I think, our environment and just for the people and the standard of living in general. To see that areas are pedestrianised and people now can enjoy it and walk around it without cars passing through. Apart from the waterfront facilities, a new coastal defence system is also being launched, and the pavement is also being constructed. So again, it's nice to see the rejuvenation of these areas, and Marsa Fon is the first one to experience this. And it's definitely incentivizing me to go up to Gozo now and take a walk around the Marsa Fon area. What do you think, Tim?
Yes, well, I mean, it was a perfect way to start this kind of project, because the street itself was already partially pedestrianised. So there were times during summer evenings, especially, I remember, where the street was completely pedestrianised. But then you wake up and cars have returned, or even late at night, the cars would start returning. So yes, now it's completely pedestrianised, which is something that personally I've wanted to see for a very, very long time, and it's great to see. Now hopefully they'll arrange the rest of Marsa Fon, including some of the ugly buildings that have been erected in recent years. Moving on, PN leader Bernard Grech has made a pretty bold promise. He said that if he becomes Prime Minister, then Malta will get off the grey list within 90 days. 90 days. It's quite
a short time frame.
It's an extremely short time frame. The government is aiming ambitiously for 18 months. Bernard Grech is saying, I can do it in 90 days. Obviously, if he becomes Prime Minister, which, as the polls are showing, is extremely unlikely. I think it's a bit of a silly promise to make, to be honest, because it's not something that's, even though it's possible, it's not something that's in his control. So you can't just promise something like that. And I think people are, are a bit more clever than that nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely overly ambitious, in my opinion, especially given the fact that it'll be a new government, and like you said, it isn't within his control. A lot of regulators and external stakeholders that to take into consideration when it comes to grey listing, which, by the way, tomorrow will be the 1 month anniversary of when Malta was grey listed. So we'll be expecting some analysis from Lovin Malta's end on exactly how things are going. But 1 month on, Tim, do you feel the impact of the grey list in Malta?
No one was going to feel it 1 month on, but people in the sector are feeling it. There's more bureaucracy, more checks, and so let's hope we get off it soon.
So hopefully Bernard Grech does become Prime Minister. Fingers crossed he does stick to his manifesto and gets us off in 90 days. Moving on to the next story now, concerning a restaurant that has faced backlash after it's offered free meals to vaccinated people. The restaurant in question is Planet Hollywood in Bay Street, which said that from Monday to Friday, every fourth main course that is ordered will be given for free. This kind of initiative and incentive kind of follows on from what a lot of restaurants and organizations, businesses are doing around the world in order to get incentivize people to get vaccinated. In fact, local burger joint Hermanos last year offered earlier this year offered free sides to vaccinated people as kind of an incentive for them to, for number one, go to the restaurant, and number two, get vaccinated so that things can return to a sense of normality. Whilst I totally kind of see where Planet Hollywood are coming from, and it's a smart marketing ploy. It received backlash online, with many people calling it discriminatory against those who choose not to get vaccinated in Malta, with many taking to the comment section saying they won't go to the restaurant again, they won't visit it because of this new deal. On the other hand, there were people who also supported and said they would be going and supporting it and making use of their fourth free main course. Planet Hollywood, on the other hand, doubled down on its idea and said, you know what, as well as a free fourth main course, if you come in on a Monday, you can get a discount according to how high your temperature is on temperature check. So if temperature is 36.9, you get 36 and 90 cents off your final bill. What do you make of it, Tim?
Yeah, well, look, about the offer itself, at the end of the day, I mean, we see these kind of offers not just for the vaccine all the time, right? As in, there are like free drinks to men or free drinks to women. I mean, we've seen this quite a lot. This is a bit different.
Ladies' night.
Yeah, exactly. What I must say is that I was quite, I really disliked the abuse that the restaurant received by some people who disagreed with them. Like, I get that there are different opinions on this topic, but there's no reason to start shouting abuse to people, especially when it comes from people who try to say, who claim to say that they're against issues like cancel culture, and then they're, calling out and trying to harass and abuse restaurants like this. So there's ways and ways of making your voice heard, and acting like a bully isn't going to convince anyone. Moving on, so the European Commission has flagged some issues related to political ownership of party media in Malta. So recently the European Commission has begun analysing each member state by state, for rule of law issues, and this is in its second report about Malta. It brought up this issue of party media stations. They said that they cite the study saying that it's concerning in terms of pluralism, that the political parties have so much power over the discourse in the country. It's actually an anomaly in Europe that Malta has that political parties own their own TV stations. No other EU country has it. Now, whether you agree with it or not, I mean, it's been discussed time and time again. But what I think is interesting is that it's quite clear that the European Union is zeroing in to more specific issues in individual member states more and more. It's becoming more direct, even with things like rule of law, becoming more interested in them. And yeah, it's worth noting that party media is an issue that they're looking at. Yeah,
not to mention the fact that David Casa recently got won a net to feature on the political station, the news stations there at the EU Commission, so people from MEPs can tune in to Maltese news watching One and Net News, which is kind of the best sources of information in my opinion. And moving on to our last story now, and concerning quite a quirky one that was uploaded to social media last night, and concerning a man who ended up paying a lesa fee of €23.29, all in 1 cent coins. To put that into perspective, that's around 2,389 1 cent coins. He went to the National Local Council to pay his lesa fine, and they told him to come back and collect the coins and pay the fine normally. He uploaded to Facebook saying that he wasn't served by the National Local Council in kind of a quirky, practical joke sense. The National Local Council then took to Facebook themselves saying that they describing it as a joke gone wrong, and asked the public to respect council employees and not waste their time, which they kind of assumed from that this guy was doing, with the fact that he had come in with 2,389 1 cent coins. A lot of people took to the comment section and said, this wasn't an act of time wasting, and you shouldn't waste local council time, and that it might have been a joke gone wrong. Others said what's the issue with him paying the fine in 1 cent coins? He's still paying the fine, should be allowed to. It's a bit of a strange, funny, quirky story.
I think it's quite obvious, right? Isn't it? This guy made it quite clear he was doing it to take the mickey out of them. And these people have work to do. They shouldn't just waste their time like that. So yes, I don't know whether the police should have got involved or not. Is a different story, and we're going to look and see into the implications of this. But yeah, don't do that. And that brings us to an end of our discussion. Make sure you stick around because our interview with Dr. Jean Karl Soler is about to proceed imminently.
In Malta, we don't say.
Welcome back to Lovin Daily. With me now is Dr. Jean Karl Soler.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for accepting to be with us on Lovin Daily today. So, Dr. Soler, you're one of the few Maltese doctors who have been openly skeptical about the COVID-19 pandemic and the way the authorities have responded to it. You've received quite a following, quite a fan base among other skeptics. However, the Superintendent of Public Health hasn't taken it so kindly to you and actually reported you to the Medical Council. How are you finding this kind of newfound fame and following, first of all?
Well, first of all, good morning to everyone who's looking. Basically, I would not say I'm skeptical about the pandemic. I don't think anyone can say that the pandemic does not exist. There's a new virus which has basically made the species jump and is now infecting human beings. The consequences of the virus are quite serious. With some people, it actually causes death. Other people, it causes quite significant suffering. The problem is the way it's being treated. And it's being treated markedly different from influenza. It's affecting people's lives in the sense that the measures that are being taken basically affect the people's freedoms, people's relationships between people's businesses, people's way of life. And this is something which I have been skeptical, not because I am some kind of an expert. I'm basically a specialist in family medicine, and I'm a specialist in occupational medicine. I'm not a virologist or an immunologist. However, on the other hand, I'm quite familiar with the way of searching for, appraising, and talking about the medical literature. And I think most of what I have said is basically substantiated with specific references, which does not mean that everything I have said is not controversial, because the medical literature in itself is controversial, but that is the basis of science, because the basis of science is discussion. And basically, if I perform a study and I find something which eventually others will not find, and I have made an error, if the error is done in good faith, then basically I have done the right thing. If I've done it honestly, you come with the findings, and the findings should be shared. We can talk even if necessary about particular examples. So I wouldn't say I'm skeptical about the pandemic. I have attracted I wouldn't use the word fan base. I think there are people who are looking for information, and I think the reason that people have liked or joined my Facebook page is because in the mainstream media, the filtering of information and the filtering of information on Facebook and YouTube is another phenomenon where basically anything which is in any way skeptical about the status quo is questioned, including Sweden's official stance to basically not go into lockdown, which was proven to be absolutely correct. Yeah. And this is now, at points, there were points where Sweden was actually ostracized or actually demonized for having done something which follows all of the basic epidemiological principles.
So let's start with
and I'd like to make clear before you go on that I have no idea what your questions are going to be.
Yes.
And this is a condition I have. I don't want to be prepared. I want to be, yeah.
So you mentioned that you said that COVID isn't being treated like the flu, right?
Yeah.
So this means that there's some kind of comparison between the two of them. So
well, I think that's quite obvious.
Okay, so it's quite obvious. How come at the peak of the pandemic in Malta, our ITUs were full with COVID-19 patients, so much so they had to open up new wards?
Yeah, well, this also happens with influenza. We have I think people remember very clearly stories in all of the papers. You were talking earlier about the politicization of the news. Well, okay, you have two polarized, maybe one party sees everything negatively and the other one sees everything positively. But I think it's quite well known that all of the stations were covering in the past, people in corridors during the flu epidemic every year.
Never had to open new ITU wards though.
Well, yes, you're correct. The reason being, when the first wave came around, you had more or less at least a 30% excess, including deaths, over what you would expect with a seasonal flu outbreak. So yes, absolutely. At that point, there was a strain on the system. There was also a strain on the system in the December period, which basically proves that this is a seasonal virus. So you don't get the strain all over the year. You get the strain because you have peaks, and you have peaks because it's seasonal.
Okay, but wait, sorry, just a wait.
And this happened all over the world.
Okay, so you're saying it's seasonal.
Absolutely.
Now, okay, so then we're seeing quite a spike in cases, not in hospitalizations,
absolutely.
Not in hospital admissions, to be fair, but in cases. So
yeah, so you hit the nail on the head.
So as it stands, as of today or as of yesterday, our 7-day moving average is around 205 new cases every single day, which is higher than it was last January, which is the peak of the winter season. So how
the peak, I believe, in the period of last year, I think was a peak. There was a peak of 500 cases in a day.
Okay, no, true, but as in January is in the midst of winter, so if it's a seasonal virus, you'd expect more cases in.
Let's be precise.
In winter.
Yeah, when you see the flu epidemic every year, it does not happen always in January. Sometimes it happens end of November, beginning of December. Sometimes it's mid-December, Christmas time. Sometimes it's January. Sometimes it flows into February.
Never July.
Yeah, but then we need to talk about viral triggering and what your parameters are going to be. So basically, at the end of the day, what is your target? Is your target to achieve a zero COVID rate? Or is your target to mitigate the impacts of the virus on individuals? And then if you do that, which parameter are you going to take? So if you look at excess mortality, so I would encourage people to look at EuroMOMO, which is the official European Union database of mortality. And I don't want to be too technical, but basically it graphs Z scores, and this is particularly useful because what that does is it graphs standard normal deviates, which means it gives you an indication. The range of normal is -2 to +2. So if it's within -2, +2 standard deviations, it's within the type of variability you would expect due to chance. If it goes beyond -2 to +2, you will see that that is likely to be not due to chance, and then there is an effect, and it can be a heat wave, it can be an infection. It's quite clear that there was a huge spike in the March, April, May period of last year, which was the pandemic. So you had all over Europe, you had deaths over excess of deaths. You also had an associated case numbers. So you had an association between the case numbers, the hospitalizations, the ITU admissions, and the deaths. And once it was not at the peak, at the time you would expect it, in winter maybe you prepare the ITU, maybe doctors don't go on leave, nurses don't go on leave, it's right and bang in the beginning of, basically in spring, you had healthcare systems stretched. You then had.
Because the doctors weren't. Doctors
no, it's because you had a pandemic which nobody knew what was going to happen. So we didn't know what was going to happen. We knew that it was going to hit hard. It hit Italy particularly bad, for example. And then you had the deaths came back to normal, with some rare exceptions. So in Belgium you had a number of peaks. Let's not forget that Belgium is not, it's one country, but there are a number of regions. So you may have one region which was not hit hard in March, April, May, and then it gets an epidemic, in August or September. This can happen. But then by and large, you then had another spike in deaths, excess deaths, towards the winter, end of autumn in some countries, in other countries it was in winter. And if you look at the excess deaths, you get this perfectly clear picture. Once you look at cases, it becomes quite different because we have never done PCR testing. of people who come in or out of the airport, or people who come in or out of the hospital, etc., for influenza. If we did, we might have found some kind of a similar phenomenon, especially with a novel virus. So if we did the same thing with the PCR testing for example, the Mexican or the swine flu in 2008, I believe it was, we might have seen something similar, because what is happening now is that the new virus has entered, it skipped. It made the species jump. There might have been some help in the sense of people going looking for viruses in caves in Wuhan or not. But it's irrelevant. At the end of the day, you have a new virus. Yeah. It starts to adapt, and the way it adapts is by the virus doesn't think, but the virus, through a natural process, there are a number of mutations. The mutations are selected for in the sense of their infectivity and the morbidity. In the sense, if it's more infectious, it's more likely to spread. If it's less, it causes less morbidity, you're less sick, you're more likely to not stay at home.
But that happens, that's an evolutionary point, and that happens over time.
But in summer, you will pick up cases if you do PCR tests. And in fact, many of the cases we're picking up, I believe, many or the majority are actually imported, because we are a country that basically, we have a lot of tourism.
Yeah, they'll be imported and then they start spreading locally as well. But
we can talk about that as well.
Okay, so if it's a seasonal virus then, right?
It is a seasonal virus.
Okay, so if you're saying it is. Now, does that mean...
no, that's not what I'm saying it is. If you look at the literature, it is a seasonal virus.
Okay, so do you expect the deaths to rise in the winter then?
Well, I hope they don't, but they will. The thing about this, you're talking about people's lives, and you're talking about deaths, and you can't trivialize a death. Every death is a tragedy. However, we have to accept that we are mortal, and one of the significant contributors to mortality are the seasonal respiratory viruses. Unfortunately, excuse me, I suffer from hay fever and a bit of asthma. Basically, when you have somebody who has multiple health problems, heart failure, diabetes, heart disease, morbid obesity, etc., or all of them together. Once they are hit with something which throws them out of balance, it's quite possible that they die because they have all the problems, but then they are exposed to a virus, and the virus is an additional insult.
But it's not only those people who are unfortunately losing their lives or even suffering.
Would you like to tell me what you think the average age people with COVID have died?
No, the average age is quite old.
Would you give an estimate?
My estimate would be something like 83.
Actually, the median is just over 80, so you're perfectly correct. So basically, and it's skewed, so it's not an average. You would take the median, but basically half of the people who have died have been over 80. Now, this is not in any way trivializing, not in any way trivializing. But there's some good news, and I'd like to share it. So what this virus does is, unlike any other disease practically in history, is you have an extremely steep mortality gradient. So the ratio between deaths in younger people and older people with other diseases might be 1.1 or 1.03 or 2. This one, it's over 10,000. This is exceptional. This is probably one of the first times. You basically have the mortality, half of it is over 80s, 2/3 of it might be the over 70s. And the mortality it basically doubles every 6 years, and it doesn't sound like much, but when you really do that and do the maths, the numbers are staggering. So the mortality in children is practically non-existent.
It's not non-existent.
So it is non-existent. When you talk about a 1 per million.
Okay.
Now, when you go up to 45 years of age, up to 45, the mortality is less than influenza. Over 45, it approaches and then it starts to exceed. But if you look at John Ioannidis, who is the professor of preventive medicine at Stanford. Stanford is number 3 university in the world. And he's the professor of, he has basically described, and you have to look at, because you're talking about cases, and the problem with that is the false positive PCRs. Basically, the infection fatality rate of, so you estimate not just the cases, the people who are getting it and who don't present for testing, and you have to estimate for that, because if you ignore that factor, you get an anomaly. You overestimate the mortality. So the infection fatality rate of COVID-19 is approximately 0.15%. Now, if you look at influenza, the range in various epidemics around the world has been between 1/5, so 80% less than influenza, to 10 times more than influenza, and the median is about 2. So it's twice as lethal. But just a minute. But the fact that you had an entry pandemic, a novel pandemic, skews that. So it's in the same ballpark. I'm not saying
okay, it's in this. Well, you've never seen ITUs have to open because of an influenza epidemic, and that's unfortunate. It's a reality.
I just said it's twice as lethal as influenza, so I'm not disagreeing with you, and I'm not being controversial.
Okay, no,
however, what you're saying does not disprove what I've just said. You are basing yourself on an observation from the local scenario, and other countries as well, and other countries as well. However, what I'm talking to you about is published, peer-reviewed medical literature from amongst the top epidemiologists in the world. Now, I will perfectly accept any argument. You come, Ioannidis has quoted this, and you would quote someone else and say, well, in the Lancet, for example, you might have somebody possibly from Imperial College make another estimate. Fine, but you can't say, look, this published medical literature, but we reject it because we know that there was, for the first time we opened this, we actually had a capacity of 45 beds. We were expecting a mortality of 4%. Because this is what we were told from China. And what happened in China is they made the mistake of estimating the case fatality rate is the infection fatality rate. Okay. And what you have an anomaly, because most sick people go to hospital, those are the better observed, you have the Hawthorne effect also because it's a novel virus, and you basically overestimate the mortality. The mortality has been steadily coming down with the India epidemic, for example. We were all hearing about all of these stories, tragic stories of people dying. However, when you look at the mortality per million with the Indian epidemic was 1/5 of the epidemics we've had in Europe. And you can say that there were some deaths which were not, maybe 1/3 of the deaths in India are not properly categorized. But there's not a fivefold error. And it also proves the seasonality, because the cases in India were in the April-May, which is exactly the flu season in that region, in those regions in India. Okay. Now you're seeing cases in Brazil, you're seeing cases in South America, Southern Hemisphere. This is normal again.
Doesn't it prove the vaccine works though? So
there's absolutely no doubt about that, without any shadow of a doubt.
That the vaccine works?
There's good news and bad news.
So the Delta variant came to Europe at least at around the same time as the vaccine started picking up. Now,
well, I wouldn't link one to the other, but okay. There are theories.
So you can.
There are theories that if you vaccinate in the middle of an epidemic, you affect the natural selection of variants. So you are, if there is a selective response to the vaccine, rather efficacy of the vaccine for different variants, by vaccinating against a variant where you're more effective against one variant and the other, rather, if you vaccinate and more effective against one variant and you're less effective against another, you can change the evolutionary part of the virus, especially with the mass vaccination programs we have seen. However, you still want to vaccinate. I'm what we're saying. You still have to vaccinate.
So you encourage people to get vaccinated? Absolutely.
I basically encourage people to be vaccinated on the basis of a risk-benefit analysis. And this is standard for medical therapy. In medical therapy, there's a lot of statistics and you can get lost. One of the easiest to understand is the number needed to treat. So basically, the number of people you need to vaccinate to prevent one death or to prevent one hospitalization. Now, these vaccines are incredibly, and I will qualify, I would prefer not to mention brand names, but it's very difficult to do that. So you have one vaccine which has a 90% efficacy, two vaccines which have a 90% efficacy, and I can't understand why other vaccines are being used. So that would be my first controversial point. Why use a vaccine which has a 65% efficacy when you have another one which is more effective, and why do you not allow people to choose? So some of the problems with the response to this pandemic is not allowing people to have the freedom of choice, which I think is so fundamental. You would accept that freedom of choice is impaired if you have a national emergency, something like the plague would, or Ebola or something with a 30 or a 20 or a 10% mortality, but with something with a 0.15% mortality during summer with lower viral triggering. And this is why you see the disassociation between the cases and the mortality. So in summer you get less viral triggering because of changes in humidity, temperature, and you ultraviolet light, and you therefore have the cases, but you don't have the people in hospital. But of course, there's also the effect of the vaccine.
But you make a different point here. You're saying that people should, if they want to take a vaccine, they should take the one that's more effective, which would be someone like
well, I think
one
that's a given.
like Pfizer.
I don't think people would disagree with that.
But
let me answer your question. So basically, if you're over 65, 70, the number needed to vaccinate, I mean, with the over 80s, it's something like 10 people. You vaccinate 7, 8, 10 people and you save a life. I mean, how can anyone argue against the vaccine? When you go down to the 50-year-olds, you're talking you need to vaccinate 300 people to save a life. You still have quite a strong argument for the vaccine. Once you go below the age of 45, 30, the numbers start increasing, and then it goes up to 1,000, 2,000. You need to vaccinate 1,000 to 2,000 people to save a life. Then when you go to the kids, the number needed to vaccinate to save one life is astronomical.
But isn't it better to just get vaccinated in case you are not that 1,000?
Well, if it was basically the equivalent of taking a teaspoon of sugar, I would agree with you. But on the other hand, we understand that there are serious adverse events with the vaccine, so you have to basically make a calculation. You basically calculate the tendency, and I have to qualify. There's a rough. You can take the tendency that basically the number needed to harm. In other words, if you vaccinate, how many people do you kill? How many people do you?
Wait, but this is what you're saying, that the vaccine can kill. Right?
Absolutely, without any doubt. Approximately, you have approximately, because these
so
have been.
Why they're giving like the vaccine to people if it's deadly? Like, isn't it?
I didn't say that. What I said is that with every medical treatment, you have people who have reactions, allergic reactions. You have people. We've seen recently people with thrombosis, people with neurological damage, and some people. Allow me. Look, with due respect to journalists, I'm not talking.
Okay.
Yeah. You have maybe 1, 2, 3 people in a million people vaccinated die. Okay, it's rare, extremely rare. But when the number needed to vaccinate to save a life approximates, or is in the ballpark of the number that of people you kill or who suffer consequences and die. So whether it's direct or whether it's part of a cascade of events, the thrombosis, and then they're admitted to hospital, and then they have multiple organ failure. So you have problems with the vaccine, and you have to take it into consideration. So in fact, for this reason, as I specify, the United Kingdom national body, which basically collects all the evidence, has basically come to the conclusion that those under the age of 18 should not be vaccinated because the harm is more likely than the benefit. And they have made exceptions for children with Down syndrome and with progressive neurological conditions, and for children who are domiciled with people who have immunological cancers. So people who have immunological problems. So if the child takes the disease home, the person who suffers from leukemia or lymphoma can get COVID and die.
So do you think Malta should allow unvaccinated teenagers to come to Malta, to come here?
That's a completely different argument. It's about whether you want to go for zero COVID or not, and that is an argument which I think is not related to the vaccine. It's related to whether you can eliminate a virus which has 4,000 variants. And with the vaccine, and I was going to talk about the one final point about the vaccine. The vaccine is probably less effective against the Delta variant in preventing infection, but it's probably as effective in preventing hospitalizations and deaths. What I've heard from Italy, and now I must qualify, I'm not talking on something I've read in the medical literature, what I heard on television from the chief coronavirus response person in Italy. He has said that he is estimating, again we have to look at real figures, he's estimating that the fact that you're vaccinated practically protects you more or less to 100% from mortality. So he's saying that if you're vaccinated, even if you get the COVID, so the Delta variant you can, the Alpha variant, the original, you get 90% efficacy. With the Delta you might get 70% efficacy with the same vaccine.
Okay.
But you basically, the effect on mortality, preventing mortality, is greater than the effect. So it's really good. If this is true, this is really good news, because you get the Delta variant with the vaccine. You get the additional immunity, so you're immunized, and you get the Delta variant, you get additional immunity. And then hopefully you don't end up with long COVID or hospitalization.
Yeah, fingers crossed. But like some time ago, though, you shared a post, right, which said that vaccines increase the risk of death due to the Delta variant by 800%.
No, I this is so interesting. I shared a post by somebody who said that, and then underneath I wrote that is incorrect. You cannot estimate that because you have to work out the denominator and then you have to do the appropriate statistical test. However, the fact that there are a number of deaths even with the vaccination is interesting, and that's why I shared the post. Look, I will not be held responsible for sharing jokes, other people writing on my page, sharing other things. For example, I've shared news items which I completely disagree with. So how can and people have commented, oh, you shared this. I also shared a slide which I was accused of doctoring, and it came from a group of researchers that basically showed that the CDC calculations, so the CDC is recommending vaccination of children, and they did that on the basis of analysis of the benefit and the harms based on the second dose of the vaccine, and they estimated that the second dose of the vaccine gives you all of the protection, when we know that you get 80%, if it's a 90% protection, you get 80% with the first dose, 10% with the second. So they were criticized in the medical literature for using the wrong mathematics, and a slide was produced with the corrections in red. Yeah. I shared that, and I was accused by people of sharing, misinterpreting or misrepresenting.
That you doctored the facts yourself. So what about when you?
I didn't, because I didn't touch the slide. I'm not very hot with all of these photo editing. But this was not photo editing. This came from this came from a group of researchers saying, listen, this is wrong. So I'm sharing things, and then I'm saying, listen, this is what this is. These are the limitations, and this is information which should fuel the discussion.
You also shared a meme, though, recently saying that COVID-19 doesn't affect those who don't give a shit. Do you believe this?
But do you accept that people have a sense of humor and can actually laugh? You know,
fair enough. But you're also a doctor, and people are seeking medical advice from you.
Allow me the answer. Okay. Rudy Giuliani was the mayor of New York when the Twin Towers came down.
Yeah.
2 weeks after the Twin Towers came down, he went on Saturday Night Live or one of these comedy shows, and he cracked the first joke about the falling of the Twin Towers. Okay? So humor, art, sarcasm absolutely should not be stopped or halted or censored by Facebook or YouTube or anyone else.
Absolutely, but the issue though is that you have people who are relying on every word you say, right? So you do have some responsibility in your capacity as a doctor to make sure people understand.
And how is a sense of humor in contrast with that?
Sometimes the line between humor and non-human fact.
Well, I would argue, sir, that is something for people to judge, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and humor is also in the brain of the beholder. So,
like that, we can confirm that was a joke, though.
Yeah, that was a joke.
Fine. Okay. No, it's fair enough.
Let's do that. Okay. Let's really do that. So you think that I, as a medical doctor, have said, and I won't use the four-letter word, has said that people who don't give a flying flamingo will not be affected by COVID, and you think I said that as a professional?
I hope not. No, I hope not.
You're serious?
I hope not.
You're serious?
But no, fair enough. But you said it's a joke. Okay. Nice. So you...
Well, I didn't think I would have to explain that, because I think that was blatantly obvious.
Sometimes common sense isn't always that common.
Well, that's not my fault, is it?
Okay, so you've also been very critical of the response to COVID-19 by several governments, including Malta, in terms of locking.
No, I have been critical of specific measures.
Exactly, which include lockdown,
absolutely,
and closing business stuff. And you're looking at Sweden, right, as a prime example?
No, I'm not looking at Sweden. The whole world is looking at Sweden, and I have shared a number of high-flying publications. Let's go to those. So we go to Chaudhry in the Lancet. Chaudhry, and he's just the first author. There was a whole list of authors. Basically looked at the lockdown measures and what effects they have on COVID cases and on COVID mortality. And he found that none of the lockdown measures had any effect on mortality. So the idea that you lock down and you save lives is proven to be, well, I have to qualify that now, has no proof. So that was one paper, and you can say that there were some problems. No, I don't think so. It was published in the Lancet. It's a very good journal, although they did retract the study on hydroxychloroquine, and that really requires but that probably needs a program on its own. Basically, you had the Lancet and Chaudhry saying, listen, mortality isn't affected, but if you close borders early on, it's associated with higher case numbers, in the sense that probably you close the borders because you have higher case numbers. And you basically was saying that you do have a reduction in cases with some of the measures. However, he did not tease out, and he couldn't. It was too early. It was this, I think, was data from May from up to June, and then he published, I think it was eventually published later on in summer. Yeah. Then you had Ben David, and within the group is Ioannidis. These are amongst, this is the group from Stanford. These are amongst the highest, the most respected and highly published. Ioannidis has 2,500 publications. And, when somebody requires 15 to become a professor, and PhD and 15 publications. 5. Some people actually get with 5. Anyway, they basically took Sweden and South Korea, because people think it's just Sweden, it was South Korea as well. Sweden and South Korea, they did not implement lockdowns. And he compared it with 14 other countries, which did implement lockdowns. And he basically took each measure, school closures, business closures, masking, quarantine of it. And he did a comparative analysis. You do a logistic regression, basically. And he basically, this is not a modeling study, because some of the modeling studies from Imperial College made all sorts of predictions about lockdown, but they were modeling studies. It's like predicting what the stock market is going to go, but then where the stock market actually goes is actually entirely different. So you had the predictions, and you had the analyses, and he found that if you do the voluntary social distancing and some of the other lesser restrictive lockdown measures, you get a reduction in case numbers, but not deaths.
But that's if people do it voluntarily, and as we've seen, that's not going to happen because people are going to gravitate towards each other.
Well, then you have to explain to me why there is a measured effect if it doesn't happen.
If they do, but they're not going to. They're not going to.
How do you know that?
Because we've seen it. We've seen
well,
it over the past.
Well, then you need to look at the data. You need to look at the paper
we've
from
seen
Ioannidis.
it in the sense that once you remove restrictions, people are going to gather together. They're not going to.
Well, then you need to write it down. It needs to be peer reviewed, and it needs to be published, and it needs to be accepted by the medical.
And if the people don't care, they just gather anyway. Then what?
But we can have different discussions and different levels of discussions. We can talk about the medical literature, or we can talk about what people perceive. And these are, and at the end of the day, I'm perfectly happy to have discussions about what people think and how they will behave, and we'll talk about mobility analysis, and maybe I should do that immediately afterwards if we have time. So basically, let's take the Ioannidis paper, and I would like to finish the argument without being. So he looked at actually voluntary social distancing, and it can't be anything else. Voluntary social distancing, and the less restrictive measures reduce case numbers. So they do reduce case numbers.
Of course.
That is agreed.
Yeah.
However, when he then looked at the additional effect of all of the more restrictive, the school closures, the business closures, the quarantine, etc., he found that there was no additional effect which could be measured. He could exclude anything up to 30%. He basically could find no effect, could not absolutely exclude an effect after 15%, but the trend was actually for a positive correlation, which means that when you institute the more restrictive lockdowns, you get more cases.
Well, okay.
You've understood me.
Yeah,
the reason for that, he postulated, he found actually a measurement in France. When you quarantine people who are sick with their relatives, you have created if they're symptomatic, because if you're asymptomatic, you don't transmit, but if you, or much less, 0 to 2%. But if you're symptomatic, you do. So if you quarantine people in their homes with their relatives, you're going to create a number of cases.
Okay.
And this is more important than the beneficial effects of the quarantine in a system where you have random appearances of cases. It's not directly one transmitting to the other, and you can control a cluster. It's appearing all over the place. These measures do not have an effect. In fact, the WHO in 2019, in issuing its evidence-based recommendations for how to respond to pandemics and epidemics, you had the whole mild, moderate, severe, and the measures recommended. And we throw all of that out of the window. Never recommended with any degree of pandemic, including with overloading of the healthcare system, were border closures, entry and exit screening, and contact tracing and quarantine of people who are just contacts. These are the things we are doing, which the WHO has said should never be done for an influenza pandemic in 2019.
Okay, so I'm very critical of lockdown measures for the reason being is that they cause huge economic damage.
I haven't even talked about that. I agree with you entirely.
But
you have to do a cost. You have to
what's-
do a cost-effectiveness analysis for each and every measure.
Okay, but then why would governments intentionally, damage their own economies and their own people around the world if it's not even going to work? So
Well, you need to ask governments, don't you?
It's
You need
not going to work to reduce virus transmission.
These are the questions that need to be asked to the people when they come to do the press conferences. Listen, sir, you have introduced a closure of the schools or a closure of the... And the WHO is making this perfectly clear. All lockdowns do is make poor people poorer.
Yes, but they do both. They do both. They
Hold
make
on.
people poor and they reduce viral transmission.
No, they don't. That's the problem. The voluntary social distancing, there was a study which was done with mobility, and you can't do it in all countries. There are countries where you have data on people's mobile phones and how they switch between cells. Okay? So basically you can track mobility and social distancing and all as a surrogate. So what you do is you calculate how many people are staying at home. And you compare that with, so distance traveled and how much distance traveled by a large number of people. We're talking about a third of the population with a particular service provider. And you see it before the measures were recommended. So once you had the start of the pandemic, you see it crashing down. So you're saying social distancing is voluntary and it works. So I'm sorry to disagree with you, but you're wrong. And then you come to basically slowly but surely you get increasing mobility. Whatever the government does, with restricting cinema, you still have an increase in mobility. And you see that there is absolutely no correlation between the actual mobility, the actual social distancing, and the number of cases. But there is an effect in the beginning, right at the beginning, when you have a sudden increase, an exponential increase in cases. People are worried and naturally they start to distance and you do have some effect. So I'm not saying it doesn't work. I think it has to be used extremely judiciously. And if you start closing down businesses and you suddenly have all the ripple effects, we lost 25% of our catering establishments. Probably the cruise industry is going to be destroyed forever. Airlines are going to go bust. Okay, and people are going to basically be discouraged from going abroad because maybe even flights are going to become. So all of these costs, these are just the businesses, because then you have to think about the suicides, you have to think about people being afraid to go to hospital, people being afraid to go and have an operation, people who are children who are now going to go back to school and going to be afraid of socializing. We have exposed an entire generation of children to a psychological model where social interaction is lethal.
You don't think they're bursting with energy to socialize after being inside for so long? I think
maybe you need to. I think you need to integrate more with the psychological literature.
Okay, so finally, just to close this off, let's go back to.
We're done already. There's so much more to talk about.
No, it can go on forever though. It's a huge debate. So just to bring it back to your followers, right? So you said I don't have a fan base, but you do have a following because you are
because I'm talking sense.
Well, you are one of the few doctors in Malta who is talking like this. That's without doubt.
I would. Well, this is. Look, you've put a lot of things on the table. I think there are a lot of doctors who have seen things which they don't agree with, and they are afraid to speak up, because if they speak up, you see what happens.
Mm-hmm. So, but some of your followers though can be quite vicious, right?
Yes.
Did
you see what I do with vicious followers?
So
you know how many? Look, I am
what do you do
to 2 o'clock in the morning going through comments and deleting.
On your own wall. Okay.
Yes, and including people who are with rather extreme views about the vaccine. Oh, this is. They contain metal and they're going to kill. There's going to be hundreds of thousands of people dying and videos by professionals who are right, but some of the things they say are not evidence-based, and so I remove those, and I also remove people. There have been not doctors have been quite fair. But there was one exception, somebody who was coming in and saying things, and I say, look, this is 1, 2, 3, 4 papers. This says this says this says this. You comment about these, and then you can go ahead and criticize, but I will not allow you to just sort of say things because I think and I feel, and then they don't reply, and then I block them, and I say, I'm sorry, sir, you either integrate with the discussion, or if you're not interested in looking at the literature, this is maybe not the right place.
So your advice would be for people who follow you to engage in discussion rather than harassment, because they've seen.
How have I ever encouraged
No, not
that?
you, not talking about yourself. I'm talking about some people who follow you and have their Facebook
If
profiles.
I find somebody scratching my car, I'd probably lose my temper and use inappropriate language. But you have to press quite a few red buttons to make me angry.
No, but as in...
Look, the way I've reacted to what I don't even want to talk about, but basically the way I reacted, I think, to the people who... I have not allowed anyone to criticize the person, even with respect to the report.
So,
Okay?
even for example...
Don't mention names, please.
Okay, I'm not mentioning names, but for example...
Because we don't know who made the report.
Okay, so
So when you names
I'm
are
gonna
mentioned, that is incorrect,
okay,
because
I'm
it
not
was from the
mentioning names.
it was from the superintendents.
Okay, not
It
about
could be anyone. in the
Okay,
superintendents.
I'm going to mention exactly. So the person who filed the report, a journalist who will challenge that point of view and gets harassed by people who support you, a restaurant who encourages people to get the vaccine, and they're met with a barrage.
No, I cannot be responsible for what people do.
I know you're not responsible,
No,
but I'm asking you
I'm
how
not.
you how what
I'm not.
what your advice is.
I'm not an
You
influencer. I'm a doctor. I'm
to a certain
speaking
extent
up.
you are an influencer.
Yeah, but it happened because I was sharing facts.
Okay.
And people have a great thirst for that. And if somebody on my page is going to say this restaurant is, the first warning is I don't like your comment, or I don't react to your comment. Then there's going to be a comment saying, listen, don't do this. And then, there's going to be the deletions. However, if somebody goes onto the webpage of Joe's store and calls Joe, all sorts of colorful things because Joe has decided to give a discount to people who are vaccinated.
Yeah.
And this person also happens to be, commenting on my page.
Okay. But just to be clear, he's not doing it with your blessing. just to be clear.
It's unbelievable. Okay.
He's not. Okay. Okay.
Well, if I haven't answered you yet, I don't know what else I need to say.
Yes, fair enough. So finally, there's going to be a protest this Sunday.
Yes.
Are you going to be attending?
That's a very good question. I am quite afraid of the way it's going to be covered. In the United States, there was this great protest against what happened, and the elections became very polarized. And it's all been characterized by one person who was wearing this funny costume of the Indian with the horns, and he is now the image of the Trump camp. What do you think that, and I'm no fan of President Trump, but he has a huge following in the sense he has had more votes than any other president ever in the history of the United States, except Joe Biden, who won the election.
Yes.
But he's being characterized just for that. Now, one of the reasons I believe there was such a hatred for the lockdown, there was such an enthusiasm for the lockdown, is because Trump was saying that they are worse than the disease. And he was right, because he said quite a few things which are quite, let's use the word controversial, including injecting people with bleach in the lungs. And it's a bit funny because we do use a surfactant during a bronchoscopy, but you wouldn't inject bleach into people's lungs. But he's being characterized by this person, so basically the most extremist is used to characterize the person, and that is, in my opinion, unfair, I would say corrupt journalism. Trump was right in not resisting the lockdowns, and I would encourage governments all over the world to resist lockdown, with the exception, as the WHO says, when you have an overloaded healthcare system, you then introduce the lockdown for 1 or 2 weeks to blunt the curve, knowing you won't save any lives, knowing you will reduce the case numbers, knowing you will reduce the load on hospital, knowing you will make poor people poorer, knowing you will ruin businesses, but then you do a risk-benefit analysis, which is what we do in business, which is what we do in science, which is what we do with medical interventions.
What we do in everyday life, as we're doing everyday life.
Yeah, exactly. So how is that controversial?
No, that's a very fair point. But you haven't answered the question. Are you going to the protest? You haven't.
Probably not.
How come?
I would be very happy to engage in discussions which are scientific. When it becomes popular, I'm afraid that the message may be not entirely something I fully support, and it may be, my presence might be linked to supporting ideas which you always end up, what's going to happen is somebody will take a picture of somebody with a t-shirt with a controversial message, and it will be characterized as such. Because what should happen is that journalists should go to this protest and should listen to what people say. And people talking about freedom, people talking about restrictions which are unconstitutional, people talking about pressures to vaccinate which go against medical ethics, autonomy, okay, non-maleficence, okay, and instead of that, it's going to be characterized by someone who has, with all due respect, I mean, if you have somebody who believes that the earth is flat, or somebody that believes that 5G can be used to control you, they're still a human being. They still deserve the respect as a human being. And that would be my perspective. If somebody is, idolizing somebody we can't mention from the Second World War, they will not get my respect. If somebody is idolizing somebody who was responsible for so many deaths in the USSR, they will not get my respect. But people who have fringe ideas, you basically tell them, listen, I don't agree with you. Maybe you need to decide about your health and about vaccination or not based on numbers and calculations and risk-benefit analysis rather than other theories we won't go into.
Yeah. Dr. Jean Karl Soler, I'm sure there's plenty more to discuss, but time is drawing to an end.
Unfortunately.
So unfortunately, thank you very much for accepting this interview.
It's a pleasure. I actually enjoyed the interview.
So did I. It's a very frank discussion. Thank you very much for following Lovin Daily. Make sure you follow lovinmalta.com for all the latest updates, and have a day full of loving.